Hi, everyone. Welcome. I'm Brett Johnson. I'm the Interim Director of the Transportation Center. And welcome to the 7th Leon Moses Distinguished Lecture in Transportation. If I recall correctly, this was a lecture that was established, obviously, in Leon's honor, but it was something that came together between our former director, Hani Mamasani, and Professor Savage. We're really happy to have tonight Rick Hornbeck from the University of Chicago. And I'm going to introduce Ian Savage to tell you a little bit more about the lecture in Leon Moses and introduce our speaker.
Hey everybody, how are we doing? Let's have a show of hands. How many people ever met Leon? Some of you did, right? Yeah. So I'm going to tell you something about Leon Moses, and then we'll introduce our speaker. So I'm Ian Savage. I appear a little bit later in the chronology here. So Leon was the former director of the Transportation Center, and this lecture came about prior to his death, and the second lecture was just after he died in 2013. So I'm going to tell you something about Leon. And normally I give this introduction, and it's very, I talk about what's going to go on, and it's somewhat disconnected from the bit at the beginning, but here it's actually very much tied together, because what Leon did early in his career, things have come full circle to where we are this evening. So probably of all the speakers we've ever had, this is the most appropriate. So let's tell you something about Leon. Leon was born in 1924 in Brooklyn, New York, and he tried to enroll several times in the Second World War and got rejected on health grounds, but that didn't stop him going to a different state and attempting to enroll there as well. He was an undergraduate at Ohio State in agricultural economics. It's kind of weird, but he told me if you lived in Brooklyn and he wanted to study economics, his parents said, you're going to study in New York City. And he didn't want to do that. And he thought the only way he could not do that was to study agricultural economics, and that's why he ended up in Ohio. And he was at Harvard, and he was working on things, what at the time was referred to as input-output analysis. So it was sort of an industrial, sort of almost Soviet-style 5-year type plan where you looked at where industry was located and looked at models of where in regions around in the country different types of economic activity went on. So he was looking at models of that, and he then worked on something which was called the Harvard Economic Project in the 1950s. And then he came to Northwestern in 1959. And he sort of moved from working on input and output analysis, and what he told me was the big change for him was that in these sorts of models, you had steel in Pittsburgh and it needed to be in Atlanta, and the way you treated the transportation of how the steel went from Pittsburgh to Atlanta was, in his mind, rather simplistic. And he thought there was more interest in sort of understanding how transportation markets worked and some of the economics of these markets. So I regretted never talking to Leon too much about this, because his move into sort of what you might regard as the industrial organization of transportation occurred at Harvard at about the same time that John Mayer and his compatriots were starting to study transportation at Harvard at the same sort of time. So he was interested in industrial location and transportation. He came here, there's his photo from the late 1950s, the Evanston Photographic Studio, and he was the director of research in the Transportation Center. The Transportation Center has been here since 1954. He was director of research in the early 1960s, and he started working in urban and regional economics and its relationship to transportation, and was involved in a rather landmark study of the renovation of the waterways network in this country and utilizing demand estimation for the waterways, using cost-benefit analysis for working about lock improvements. So he was doing that. Then he moved into the 1970s into sort of the era of regulation and deregulation. I really love this picture. This is sort of, people recognize this as the basement of their the Economics Department's former home in the Jacobs Center across the street from the Transportation Center. Leon in sort of classic mode here, tie slightly untied. I think this must have been after they banned smoking for lecturers and students in the classroom. But Leon sort of out making a point here, itching for a fight. Leon was that sort of guy, sort of in-your-face sort of guy, right? So he was interested in industrial production. So he was president of the Regional Science Associations. He was the director of our Fair Institute here in the late 1970s. And he organized a whole series of conferences in the 1970s and going to the 80s, looking at sort of movements into deregulation. He had Bob Crandall here in 1976 talking about deregulating the airlines. He had similar one with Stephen Breyer, who was eventually on the Supreme Court, talking about trucking deregulation. A whole series of these conferences. And by the time we go into the 1980s, we were dealing with the consequences of deregulation. And there was concerns about safety, which is where I come in. I recognize two of the people in that picture at the top. I don't recognize the third person. Those just recognize Duane Merrick, our longtime associate director in the middle there, and Leon. This was Halloween 1989. The day our book out of the Deregulation Safety Conference was published. He also looked at hazardous materials transportation, thinking about where hazardous materials were manufactured, where they were used. So he did that, and he did that until he retired in 2005. So he retired then, and then he lived until 2013. So I did want to say that this is the history of the lectures. The first one, Bob Gordon's in front row here, was our very first lecturer in this series. That was when Leon was alive, and that was in the old Allen Center building. Leon and person with him, is for those who knew Leon, was his wife, Ray, who was a linguistics professor here at Northwestern. So Leon and Ray were kind of mainstays of social and intellectual life here on the Evanston campus. I gave the second one just after Leon's death, a few days after Leon's death in 2013. And we've had a series of talks, including in 2019 on this very stage where we had Nobel Prize winner Dan McFadden talking about travel demand and how machine learning things could enter into it. This was 2019. Here we are 6 years later, and things have kind of moved on a bit. But I'd like to say something about the fact that tonight's lecture kind of ties back to where Leon was in the very beginning. Now, if you remember, Leon was very interested in what transportation's role was and the study of transportation in the distribution of economic activity in international and domestic production and consumption was. So Rich Hornbeck's going to give this talk tonight, and what Rick is going to be talking about is this. And when I put the slide together, I knew there would be at least a couple of people in this room who actually know what this picture is of. So this is the very first steam locomotive in the state of Minnesota. So we're going to be talking about the westward expansion of the railroads, primarily after the Civil War. But what Rick is going to be talking about is something which has become quite a big deal in transportation economics. I come from the era of transportation economics of sort of the industrial organization of this, where people study about regulation, deregulation, the actual sort of way the transportation firms were organized. And the trade theorists who were kind of big in the very beginning, the sort of input-output analysis that Leon was doing in the 1950s, re-entered the transportation economics market about 15 years ago. They were bringing the usual sorts of models of thinking about where goods were consumed and produced, where people moved about the country, and using a lot of data. Well, I'm not exactly going to call it big data in the sense it's not like cell phone records, but in terms of going to archives and getting plenty of data and looking at sort of historical changes. And while we're going to be talking about railroads this evening, people associated with Rick have worked in many other areas of transportation as well. So I'll give you some examples. Obviously, things like the opening of the new locks in the Panama Canal at top left. would lead to some redistribution of where goods enter the United States. The building interstate highway system, which some people have studied, and the effects on economic activity from that. Building of rural roads in India. And also saying, which isn't quite so much infrastructure, but is more big changes that went on in the technology here, which led to big changes, would be the development of the jet aircraft. And this was the very first 747, late 1960s. And the one on the right, which was a view on the deck of Malcolm McLean's very first container ship. It's interesting, that was 1956, which was the same year as the interstate highway system was put into place, which was the same year that the Boeing 707 came in. So, I mean, if we're looking at sort of when was the big eras and big technological change in transportation, 1956 lives up at the top here. So that's what's going on. So it's been quite a revival. Transportation economics was a little bit in the wilderness for many years. And now we start seeing it's become kind of fashionable again. And the trade and the urban economists have been at the forefront of this change. So I find it really exciting, the fact that we can have one of the leading lights of these quantitative spatial models here with us today. So I'm going to now pass it over to Rick, who's going to talk about what he's going to talk about. So Rick, please, I'll change the slides. Okay.
Does the clicker work? Oh, yeah. Okay. Great. Yeah, thanks very much. Thanks for the very kind introduction. How's the volume in the back? Is that good? Okay, great. So very, very glad to be talking about this this evening. So what I wanted to kind of jump into is, how do we think about what the gains from transportation infrastructure are? What might classic approaches have sort of considered? And, why might else we think about there being much larger gains than maybe have been sort of highlighted recently? So when we think about generally, what is the value of something? The starting point of economics is generally based on sort of how much people are willing to pay for that thing, right? And so, sort of on the margin, we tend to value things according to what people are willing to pay for them. And that's kind of at the heart of what Vogel's sort of Nobel Prize winning research on the railroads was about. It was introducing this social savings methodology, which sort of looked at the transportation sector itself and thought about there being a particular demand curve for transportation services. And people were willing to pay a certain amount for transportation. Without the railroads, maybe they would have had to pay somewhat more for transportation. But we could think about sort of bounding the value of the railroads based on that, and finding sort of relatively small effects. And so I think the literature struggled for some time to sort of understand, well, why are the effects so small? Well, we kind of intuitively should surely understand that it had a very transformative effect on the economy. And so how do we marry these two thoughts? That seemingly it was very, very important, but somehow this sort of upper bound is pretty small. And so how do we break out of this upper bound? Now, there's sort of a second sort of parallel approach in economics generally to sort of valuing things and how much people are willing to pay for them. In models where, where land is fixed in a place and labor and capital are mobile, there's kind of an intuition that the economic gains from things will be capitalized into land values, right? If a city becomes more appealing, the houses in that city are become more valuable. If some place becomes more productive, the land, the thing that you need to buy into to produce in that place is going to become more valuable. So there's a common general approach in economics to thinking about land values capitalizing the gains from some increased production or consumption of amenities, something that makes a place more appealing. And some of this relates back to what Vogel was thinking about, where land values played some role in Vogel's analysis as well, but again, finding sort of relatively limited effects. And so what I've been sort of working on more recently is how to break out of this and understand why, in fact, the gains can be much larger from what you would get from a hedonic method or what you would get from a social savings type approach. And in particular, the key departure is going to be sort of allowing for and thinking about the role of different distortions in the economy. And what do I mean by distortions? I mean things like not just taxes or certain regulations, but also market power. If firms are doing things to sort of restrict production, to raise prices, the marginal product of their inputs, what they get from producing, might actually be more than the cost of those inputs themselves. And so whether it's that firms don't want to expand production because they have market power, or whether it's because firms can't expand production because they face capital market frictions, they have difficulty getting access to finance, there's sort of various reasons why the economy might be distorted away from efficiency. And in that world, in this distorted world, I'm going to sort of argue for you and try to explain tonight why transportation infrastructure can have really an order of magnitude bigger gain for the aggregate economy than what you would get in an efficient, starting from an efficient benchmark. And so the real payoff from this also is that we can sort of go back to Solo's framework in the 1950s and thinking about sort of work since, where you can get aggregate productivity growth from infrastructure, not directly through technological innovation, but from increasing input use where that use is distorted below efficient levels. Right? And if that doesn't make sense, I think by the end of this, I'm going to try to make that make a lot more sense. So I'm really thrilled that Joel is here tonight. And I think one of the punchlines I want to kind of develop is, in a sense, like technological innovation is wonderful. It's why we have a lot more surplus in the economy today. It's the closest thing in economics to a free lunch, in the sense that we can get more output without necessarily using more inputs, right? So technological innovation really is the kind of driver of economic growth over long periods of time. But I would say that this, lever of riches, so to speak, or these gifts from Athena, in technological innovation, can be very hard to come by. Athena can be relatively, frugal in handing out these gifts, and so it's very hard to actually improve technology. Maybe we get 1% a year if we're lucky, 2%, 0.5%. So it's very hard to actually improve our ability to turn things into other things. But we can actually get really substantial aggregate productivity growth, not through actually technological innovation itself, but through infrastructure when the economy is distorted. Right? And so that's what I kind of really want to emphasize tonight. Okay? So the canonical infrastructure that often we think about playing a really important role in the historical development of the US economy and was the focus of Fogel's kind of analysis of this is the railroads, and in particular the expansion of the railroads through the latter half of the 19th century. So this question is sort of, did the railroads have substantial impact on aggregate economic growth in the US? Fogel argued no. And he did this bounding exercise and came up with a number that the sort of total impact of the railroads in the US was less than 2.7% of US GDP on an annualized basis. And how did he get such a small number? Well, effectively, the thought exercise behind what he did was this. It's that you can imagine in a world in which there are the railroads and people are transporting a certain quantity of goods in 1890. You could imagine if we didn't have the railroads, we could still, in principle, transport that same quantity of goods at some higher cost, just using the waterway network and wagon transportation and things like that. So if you think about that difference in price of transporting goods with the railroads and with the waterways, and you multiply that by the total quantity of goods that are being transported, you get this sort of large rectangle. And that rectangle for Fogel was an upper bound on the aggregate gains from the railroads, because in principle, we wouldn't even have to keep transporting all the same things. If transportation got more expensive, we think about demand curves sloping down, and we could actually cut back on transportation and do even better than if we had to do the same thing. So the thought experiment here would be, think about how much email is worth to you. Well, think about like how many emails you might get or receive in any particular day. If you didn't have access to email, how much more would it cost to exchange that same information, whether by mail or telephone or text or something else? And you could say, like, okay, well, we're exchanging all this different information. If we didn't have email, we could accommodate the absence of email with some cost. And that cost should be an upper bound on the value of email to you. It's sort of based on sort of what you'd be willing to pay for it. But of course, if you cut back on email, maybe some emails you don't want to receive, but some emails that you send might actually have a real profound benefit for some of the recipients, or it might have some value to the aggregate economy beyond what you yourself actually necessarily internalize. And so there's some sense that like email, by expanding the amount of information that people share with each other, if that encourages more innovation, if it has benefits to other people in terms of spreading knowledge, there might be a lot of broader gains to the economy where we might have inefficiently been doing too little information exchange otherwise. And so it's actually the fact that the access to this new technology expands the amount that we use it, that's a much larger benefit. For Fogel, the fact that people would cut back on transportation without the railroads means that railroads were even less good than he would have thought. But I'm going to argue that the fact that transportation would have cut back without the railroads is actually going to generate a lot of aggregate losses in the US economy, because those things that are going to get cut back on were sort of quite a bit more productive on the margin than Fogel was sort of taking into account. Okay. So I want to, one of the takeaways then for Fogel wasn't just that the railroads weren't influential. It was really a broader point also that if the railroads couldn't be that influential, then really no one technology could ever be particularly influential for economic growth. That the railroads were worth maybe like 2 years of productivity growth or 2 years of economic growth or something. So really nothing is indispensable, and nothing's really that particularly pivotal. And I want to kind of argue that some of these really pivotal technologies, the internet, electricity, the sorts of things that sort of enable a lot of other activity to take place, can actually generate much larger outsized gains than you would think from looking at the willingness to pay for that particular technology itself. Okay. All right. So to kind of fix thoughts, I think it's useful to start with what the navigable waterway network would have looked like, without the roads. And this includes canals that were built, but along with like transportation around the coast and the lakes and such. And then if you think about the railroads rolling out over time, you have some early railroads by 1850 that are sort of complementing the waterway network and providing low-cost transportation where it wasn't otherwise available. Both the waterways and the railroads were kind of similarly relatively cheap. Actually, the main gains from the railroads was in reducing the amount of expensive wagon transportation that had to take place. So you see these early railroads, by 1860, 1870, 1880, 1890, 1900, the network is sort of rolling out throughout the country. It's getting increasingly dense. It's reducing the amount of expensive wagon transportation that's going to have to take place. It's both interacting with, it's substituting for the waterway network, it's complementing the waterway network. They're sort of being used in concert with each other. And they're interacting in very interesting ways that it's going to be important to think about. Okay. So one of the things that in some earlier work Dave Donaldson and I were working on was trying to think about, well, there were certain aspects of Fogel's analysis that involved some calculations and some other things that were assuming certain aspects. Could we maybe try to more directly estimate, in a sense, as this railroad network is rolling out, how much gain is that generating? In this hedonic intuition, there was some sense that some of these gains should get reflected in land values increasing. That as the railroads sort of bring something to these different places, people should be more willing to settle those places. The agricultural land should get more valuable. We could look at agricultural land value itself and kind of use that to estimate the gains from the railroad network. So there's something about the railroads rolling out, but the railroads are going almost everywhere, and they're affecting almost everywhere. And so there's somewhat of a methodological challenge of, well, we want to estimate the effects of the railroads, but really, what does it mean to estimate the effect of a railroad? You might get a railroad line in your county, but what does that really, the fact that you have a railroad line, what does that really give you? In principle, if you already had a navigable waterway before, the fact that you get a railroad line might not have that much effect. Versus if you didn't have a navigable waterway, getting a railroad might have a pretty big effect. Once you have some railroads, are those railroads taking you to a useful location? That'll be particularly useful. Are they connecting you to some market that's not particularly useful to get connected to? That won't be so useful. Maybe some of the roads might actually have a negative effect on you because previously, upstate New York had relatively captive access to New York City. And as the railroad network is rolling out, some of those places in upstate New York are going to lose agricultural activity because now stuff is being imported to New York City from the Midwest, and as agricultural land in upstate New York is becoming less valuable. So somehow just purely looking at who gets a railroad, who doesn't get a railroad, isn't particularly satisfying. And so we wanted to kind of model, in a sense, well, what are railroads ultimately bringing? They're bringing some notion of market access. They're bringing some connectedness to other places. And could we directly try to model and embrace this idea that it's connections to other places that are going to be valuable, not just having a railroad line itself? And so what we did was to try to then use the rollout of the railroad network and the resulting changes in market access in those places to understand how that market access affected agricultural land value, and then what the effects would be from rolling back the railroad network and sort of doing a counterfactual where instead of having this railroad network, if we rolled back to this waterway network, railroads go away, but market access still remains to some degree because you could still use these waterways. And then we have a nice framework for thinking about, well, how much would market access fall without the railroads, and what would be the resulting drop in land values? Okay. So that's what we did. In this, we found an impact on land values themselves that was worth about 3.2% of GDP. And so, somewhat larger, but not really that meaningfully larger than what Fogel had found. But of course, just looking within agricultural land values, maybe there's going to be broader gains. And I think this was more of a methodological step to kind of open up a path for further analysis and ways of thinking about how the railroad network might have affected other aspects of the economy. Okay. So to do so, we constructed that network database of waterways, railroad lines. We assigned transportation routes. We calculated lowest cost routes between different pairs of counties. So we had this sort of transportation point-to-point hub, this sort of matrix. And we combined that in with some trade theory. And I'm not going to kind of go into it in too much detail. But it's essentially what Ian was noting about how Leon Moses would have been thinking about sort of a demand for goods and a spatial positioning where there's consumers in different places. They all have some preferences over goods and varieties of goods that you can potentially make in different other locations. Producers in each location have some production function themselves. They're going to use land, labor, capital, materials. Those materials themselves are potentially imported from other locations. Both output and materials are going to be costly to trade with some iceberg transportation costs. Capital and labor are freely mobile, but land is fixed. And so in an incidence sense, the gains in principle should be capitalized into land values. Okay? And then we can think about output and input choices being impacted by this sort of index of market access. And I think the key methodological step that came out of this model is that with the right sorts of distributional assumptions that sort of trade theory has been working on in recent years, you can get all these complicated sort of supply and demand forces to sort of collapse down into sort of one summary statistic of market access. And so a place's market access in some county is going to be a sum over the cost of getting to all other destinations D, the size of those markets D, and those places' lack of access to other markets. And so my market access will go up as a place if it becomes cheap for me to trade with a very large market that doesn't have many other markets that it can trade with. So that kind of reflects that notion of it being useful to have access to kind of captive markets because I'm going to have good prices that I can potentially sell stuff to them for. And we can approximate that with just sort of a sum over the cost of getting to different places and the population size of those places, because the population size already kind of reflects the output in the market and its connectedness to other places. Okay. But when did we end up starting? Like, when am I going until? 30 minutes, okay. So I'm going a bit fast through this because I want to kind of get to the things I'm excited about in a bit. Okay, so what the resulting implications of kind of that theory, though, is that we can take these maps of the railroad network rolling out over time, and we can turn it into maps that I have a much easier sense of how to analyze. Okay? And so what I'm showing in this map is the darker shaded counties are counties that had a larger change, a larger growth in market access from 1860 to 1870. From 1870 to 1880, 1880 to 1890, 1890 to 1900. So over each of these sort of decade pairs, we can now map everything that was happening with the rollout of the railroad network into some sense of like more and less treated counties. Because everyone was being treated by the railroad network. And there are all these complicated spillover effects from that treatment on other locations as well. And so it's very hard to think about how to analyze that. But I'm a lot better positioned to think about, okay, what's going on with these darker shaded counties relative to lighter shaded counties within the same state, within the same sort of general geographic area. And now I can start to think about, okay, well, what's happening to land values in these different places, in the darker shaded places relative to the lighter shaded ones, or what's happening to manufacturing output, what's happening to wages, what's happening to firm sizes, what's happening to any number of different outcomes, and sort of darker shaded counties relative to lighter shaded counties within the same, otherwise sort of general area. Okay. And so armed with that, we have sort of a nice toolkit to think about like what more broadly is happening as the railroad network is rolling out. Okay. And so land values, I sort of increasingly came to understand, are really only going to be, a small part of the overall story. And a lot of this came out from working, advising my co-author on this project, Martin Rotenberg. He wrote his job market paper, his thesis, his PhD thesis on firms in India and how firms in India were affected by capital market subsidies that sort of shifted capital between different types of firms. And the key thing for him in that paper was sort of recognizing that different firms might have different marginal products of capital. Some firms might be pretty capital constrained and have a really high return to using capital. Some firms might have a relatively easy time getting access to capital, so they might have a relatively low marginal return for capital. And so when the government regulates capital markets, a really key thing to understand is not just in aggregate how much does it expand capital or contract capital, but how does it shift it between different types of firms? Are you getting capital to the types of firms that really can productively use it? Or are you maybe distorting capital away from those firms and shifting it to the firms that don't have such productive uses for it? And so it's going to matter a lot for aggregate productivity who's actually getting access to that capital. And that same intuition seemed to really nicely apply to these different counties, that the railroads are going to be shifting economic activity from some counties to other counties. And for aggregate US productivity, it's going to similarly be really important to think about, well, these counties that railroads are shifting economic activity into, are these counties that are relatively more productive on the margin, that were sort of constrained counties? Or are they counties that sort of were relatively less productive? And it's actually these inputs would be more productively used back in the lighter shaded counties that already had good access to markets. And so tracing out how the railroads are shifting economic activity across space can then end up potentially being very influential for how it's affecting aggregate productivity in the US economy. And so to try to break out of land values as like the summary measure of all economic gains in the US, land values are capitalized sort of factor payments to particular inputs. But getting back to why is technological innovation so useful is what we really care about is the surplus that's generated that's not actually paid out to land or labor or capital. So you can start by thinking about sort of surplus in the US economy in a particular county or adding up over all counties. Sort of aggregate productivity, in a sense, is the total revenue of a particular place minus the sum of expenditures in that place. And what's going to be great about total factor productivity growth or technological innovation is that we're going to get more revenue relative to the increases in input expenditures. There's just going to be more surplus. Now, how that surplus is distributed, who gets to consume it, I don't know. But at least if there's more overall surplus, then some people are going to be able to potentially consume that. So why not, instead of just looking at payments to the land, let's look at like actual surplus that's generated in particular counties. So the starting point here now is going to be thinking about, well, how does market integration, how does this increase in market access in particular counties affect aggregate productivity in those particular counties, and then sum that up to aggregate productivity in the overall US economy. And from this, we're going to find much larger effects. So from this paper, we find that the railroads actually contributed aggregate productivity gains that where losing the railroads would have cost about 27% of GDP in terms of aggregate economic surplus. So the economic value that was created by the railroads when they're removed is equivalent to an annual hit of about 27% of GDP. So an order of magnitude now larger than what Fogel had found, and substantially larger than what I had found in the previous work with Donaldson. And you would actually take this effect and you would add it to that previous effect that I'd found with Donaldson on land values. So like the total would be more on the order of like 30%. This 27% plus the 3% that's in land values themselves. Now, if you would replace the railroad network instead with like an expanded waterway network with canals and such, you would have only really mitigated a pretty small amount of that loss. So Fogel's idea that we could have replaced the railroads with extended canals wouldn't have nearly gained what the railroads themselves would have. And if you take these gains and you think about it relative to the total amount of capital that was invested in the railroad network, which were heavily capitalized companies, the social rate of return on the capital that these private companies were investing was about 48%, right? So, for every $100 of capital the railroad companies were investing, it was generating $48 to sort of overall US society. But, the railroad companies themselves clearly weren't earning a 48% rate of return. The private rate of return that they were earning was about 10 times less. So the social rate of return on the capital from these railroad companies was about 10 times the private rate of return that they themselves were earning and paying out to investors. Right? So a strong sense that the US government and the US economy would have reasonably wanted to substantially subsidize and support the expansion of this infrastructure, which was generating some private gains and some gains for landowners, but really substantial gains elsewhere in the economy. So now you might be wondering, did I just make a mistake? How could the effects potentially be like this large? I want to help you understand why these effects can be so large. And the key thing is going to come back to the sense of there being distortions in the economy. That's going to generate this much larger multiple. Okay, so the starting point for this is going to be data that Martin and I collected from the Census of Manufacturers, tabulated at the county by industry level. So for 1860, 1870, and 1880, for each county and industry, we know its value of output, material costs, labor costs, and capital stock. So the basic information we would sort of want to compare sort of total revenues to total input expenditures. It looks sort of like this. And for each county and sort of each major industry in these counties, it lists out the number of establishments, capital stock, employees, wages, materials, and product value. So just kind of tables and tables of this that we had entered in, which was actually relatively straightforward. I look back on this with fondness because the more recent data that we've been collecting has been these handwritten establishment level records which is for each manufacturing establishment in the United States in 1850, 60, 70, and 80, for each establishment as the name of the establishment, the industry that it's in, its capital stock, its materials, its products, its power, its information on employees and such. Okay. And actually just today, after like a many-year effort of sort of collecting, digitizing, and bringing together this data, just today we launched a website, cmfdata.org, where you can download not just all these images, but all the digitized and clean data at the establishment level for all of those decades. Right? So cmfdata.org is just sort of generally available now to the broader profession. It was a bit of a coincidence. It was like the day that I was coming here. But I'm glad to announce it, and people can go out and use that data however you see fit. Okay. All right. So we're going to measure county productivity now, which is the total value of revenue minus total input expenditures. And the way to think about this is how much output value is not used up by input costs, right? Because inputs themselves are things that other people could potentially consume. I wouldn't want to buy a bunch of fresh blueberries to make blueberry pie because those fresh blueberries have a lot of value to actually consuming blueberries directly. So if I buy, $30 worth of fresh blueberries and make a $15 pie, that's going to be destroying value in the economy, right? So that wouldn't be like a surplus enhancing activity to do. So how much, how many pies can I get minus, what's the value of the fruit that I used up in those pies? Okay. So what is the impact then of market access on log productivity? There's a couple of steps of math, but basically if you take the log of this, right, and you take the derivative of that with respect to market access, you get 1 over productivity times the derivative of each of these terms with respect to market access. Expressed in percent terms, basically you get that productivity is increased with market access. It's the percent impact on revenue minus the revenue share weighted percent impacts on expenditures. So if market access is increasing revenue by 1%, and it's increasing input expenditures across different inputs by 1%, but if some of that revenue is not getting paid out to expenditures, then that's going to generate an increase in surplus as well. And the nice thing about this is that you can take this and you can add and subtract something that looks like Solo's residual, that looks like this TFP type term. So you can add and subtract the output elasticities of if you were to increase input expenditure by 1%, by what percent would you expect output to go up? So you can decompose growth and surplus into a first term here, that I know I'm going like really fast through this, but this first term is what Solo in the 1950s would have called the total factor productivity, and it became known as the Solo residual. This is essentially technological growth and technological innovation. This is the economy getting better at turning inputs into outputs. There's a second term here, though, also, which is growth in input expenditures in counties and inputs where the marginal product of those inputs is greater than their marginal cost. And so it's really this second term here that's going to be the focus of my work, which is some gap between how much the inputs produce and how much those inputs actually cost. And in an efficient economy, which Solo would have assumed in the 1950s, this term is equal to this term. These S's are equal to the alphas. This second term drops out, and all growth and surplus comes from total factor productivity growth. So in an efficient economy, the only real way over the long term you get surplus growth is through innovation, right? That's what Joel would help us understand about like where does this innovation come from, and why is it so important to understand where innovation comes from is because that's really the only long-run source of growth and surplus, right? If we just increase GDP in the US by having more people in the US, right, that doesn't necessarily sort of increase total surplus, right? But if we can get more GDP in the US because the people that are here become more productive, then that's going to create more surplus for sort of people overall to consume. In an efficient economy. Right? So this is what Solo would be talking about. This would be coming from technological innovation, but this is a distortion term, and these distortions matter whenever inputs themselves are increasing. So where do these distortions come from? Where do these gaps come from? They reflect that if firms use more inputs, they're going to produce more output than those inputs themselves actually cost. And why would that be? Well, one thing, it might be due to firm markups. That firms themselves might not want to keep producing more until their output is equal to their input, because firms are purposely cutting back production in order to raise prices. Right? So Apple doesn't make iPhones until the marginal value of that last iPhone they make is equal to their marginal cost of making an iPhone. Right? They stopped making iPhones well before that. So if Apple were to make an extra iPhone, if we were to do something that induced Apple to make some more iPhones, the value of those iPhones they make would be discretely larger than the cost to them of making those iPhones, right? There would be more surplus in the economy if we could somehow do something to get Apple to expand. Similarly, firms that are capital constrained, that face some input frictions or taxes or other constraints, firms that are capital constrained, they would like to expand their production, but they just can't because they can't get access to financing. And so these firms throughout the economy, they can't get access to finance to expand production. Again, if we could do something somehow to get those firms to produce more, we would get more bang than the buck that it costs. Okay? We would get more output from them than the cost of the additional inputs that they use. And so you can start to see where this is headed, that I'm saying if somehow we could get these firms that have market power, or these firms that have sort of face input frictions, if somehow we could get these firms to produce more, we would actually get surplus from that. And one of the most amazing technologies that's happened in history that got firms to produce more and expand activity was that massive rollout of the railroad network across space, that it shifted inputs. It brought more people into the United States. And as more people got drawn into the United States, as more land got used in production, as more capital investment flowed into the United States, all of those people were actually producing more output than their wages. Right? And so there was a lot of surplus associated with those immigrants coming to the United States. And so something that expands the scale of the US economy and something that shifts activity from some places to other places is going to potentially generate huge surplus. And that surplus shows up additively with the gains and surplus you would get from technological innovation. So if you want growth and surplus, it can come from TFP growth and technological innovation, or it can similarly just come from these distortions and increased input use. And so the point that I'm trying to make, and I was trying to make from the beginning, is that both of these lead to surplus growth, but this is actually quite hard. You get maybe 1% a year if you're lucky, or 2%. But this can actually be quite a bit easier, because these distortions are all throughout the economy. And so if we can do something to increase input use where there are these distortions, we can get a lot of aggregate growth from that. Okay. All right. So we estimate then in the end really substantial increases in county productivity from the road or the railroad network, that a 1 standard deviation greater increase in market access from those maps was associated with a 20% increase in manufacturing productivity in these counties, predominantly through increasing that second allocative efficiency term, rather than directly increasing total factor productivity or innovation itself. So it's not that it made these places more productive at turning inputs into outputs, it just increased input use in places where those inputs were being inefficiently used too little. The railroads themselves didn't make these places more efficient, it didn't reduce those gaps. But in the presence of those gaps, increases in input uses really matter. And so there's kind of a nice circling back to what Ian was describing about Leon Moses's early research, and thinking about this is a very real reason why location matters. And sort of where economic activity is happening matters because in some places it's more distorted than in other places. So without the railroads, if you take away the railroads, how much time do I have again? Like 13 minutes? Yeah. So if you were to take away the railroads, okay, you could calculate, well, what would happen to market access in all of these counties when you take away the railroads? So the darker shaded places here are the ones that lose more market access. Right? If you look at that along with which places are there larger or smaller distortions, the darker shaded counties here are the counties that have larger distortions. And if you essentially multiply this sort of magnitude of the distortion by those drops in market access, you get these resulting drops in productivity. So the darker shaded counties here are the ones that are experiencing a bigger drop in productivity when you start to remove the railroad network. And if you add that up in dollar terms, and you express it relative to aggregate US GDP, that's where that 27% number comes from. Okay. So why are we finding something so large? All right, why can these effects be so large? It's driven by that misallocation of factors across places, industries, inputs, things like that. And so what the railroads are doing is it's increasing inputs in marginally productive counties. It's increasing inputs in places where markups or capital market frictions or otherwise things are making firms too small. Now, if I were to describe a monopoly to you, or a monopolist, or a firm with a great degree of market power, we generally think of those as large firms. Right? But the problem with a monopolist is that it's actually not large enough. Right? Apple's a large firm, but it's not actually large enough. We would want Apple making more iPhones. Because on the margin, that last iPhone that they make has a lot of value associated with it relative to the cost of making an iPhone. So the problem with Apple is that it's too small. Not to pick on my new friend from Uber, in the back, but like, I don't want to call Uber a monopolist, especially if we're being like recorded. But if it were a monopolist or if it did have some market power, the problem is that it's actually too small. The distortion is that there's not enough Uber rides that are going on, because on the margin, that last Uber ride generates a lot of value for the user, which is in excess of like the actual cost of driving, right? There's some profit wedge, there's some markup, and that's creating a distortion that's making the firm too small. So there are all of these firms throughout the economy, in manufacturing, and agricultural, and services, and all throughout the economy, that are too small. And so when something like the railroads comes in, it encourages all those firms to expand. Now, why wasn't that in Fogel's calculation? Well, it's because Uber and Apple and these companies, they don't actually want to expand. Like Apple's willingness to pay for cheaper shipping to the US from wherever it's making its iPhones is relatively limited because Apple doesn't even really want to make more iPhones. It's making the profit maximizing number of iPhones. So if we reduce the cost of transportation, Apple's only willing to pay a little bit for cheaper transportation. But if by reducing the cost of transportation, Apple actually makes more iPhones, society really wants Apple to be doing that. Right? So society benefits a lot more from reduced transportation costs than the people who are actually buying the transportation services themselves. So the willingness to pay for transportation, the sort of cost savings in a sense that people are willing to pay for, dramatically understate the gains to society from these firms actually using more transportation services. And so you might then start to wonder, well, is this just specific to the historical United States? Maybe the historical US was like very distorted. When I show this map of like where these distortions are, larger or smaller, maybe this was the case historically, but it would no longer be true now. And so one thing you could do is you can compare, well, what are the magnitude of distortions in like the 19th century US manufacturing? What are the magnitudes of the distortions in modern, US census and manufacturers data? And they're actually relatively similar. The sort of overall average level of markups, the degree of capital market frictions, it's not sort of dramatically different in the modern manufacturing data as in the historical US manufacturing data. If anything, the historical distortions are even maybe slightly smaller than they are in the modern US data. So it's not that this opportunity for growth through distortions has actually gone away. If anything, it's very much still around and even maybe slightly larger. All right, so the point here is that when resources are allocated inefficiently, widely used infrastructure or technologies can have substantially larger economic benefits. Okay. And this is something I kind of really want to sort of pass on to people. And I've been recently, for example, like working with the World Bank to try to use this framework to think about the gains of some middle corridor infrastructure investments in Asia, where you think about there being distortions across different markets in Asia that might get connected or sort of shifted activity to. And when you have these different distortions, something that gets used can have really much substantially larger benefits. Okay. So I would say it's very hard to make places more efficient. Right? Most of the time when people think about distortions nowadays in modern economics, they think about, for example, really nice work by Chiang Hai-shek and Pete Klenow, who argue that like, there's very large distortions in the economy. And if we could reduce those distortions, there would be really tremendous aggregate economic benefits from that. And I don't disagree with that in a sense. If you take the current economy that's distorted, if you got rid of those distortions, there would be real gains from that. The problem is, like, I don't know how we're going to actually get rid of those distortions, right? Like, are we just going to get rid of market power? Or are you going to get rid of capital market frictions? It would be good if you could do it, but like, I don't know how you get from here to there. Like, I don't know how you necessarily dramatically remove distortions in the US economy. So I would say it's hard to actually make places more efficient and reduce the distortions themselves. What's easy to do is to look for those firms or places or areas where there actually are distortions and try to push more economic activity into there or try to make capital more available. Right? So when I talk to somebody, I was talking to this guy who cleans my house, owns a small business, cleans my house, and he was talking to a friend who had a trucking business, right? And his truck broke down, and he needed to kind of like make some repairs to improve this truck. And, but he couldn't get access to financing. Like banks wouldn't lend him some money, give him a small loan to sort of make improvements to this truck. So he turned to my friend who was cleaning houses and asked for a loan. And I was like giving some advice. I was giving him some just general advice on how to like set up some accounts for his kids or whatever. And I was like, I don't know if this is so great for you to be doing this, to giving loans to these people. He was like, well, this guy's going to pay me, a 40% interest rate, to help fix up his truck. And he's going to give me like the truck as collateral. I was like, oh yeah, that sounds actually kind of reasonable. Maybe I should give you money to lend to this guy for like fixing up this truck. But then so you kind of realize like there's people that have really high marginal product activities out there in the economy, but they just can't get the access to the finance to take advantage of it. And so if we could somehow increase trucking, or if we could like increase input use amongst those people that have like distorted access to it, we can get really large gains from that, right? So it's hard to make places more efficient. It's relatively easy to try to increase input use in places that are inefficient, right? So when we think about all like the port projects and like general efforts to expand or improve infrastructure in the US and increase aggregate economic activity in the US, in a world where the US was a perfectly efficient economy, the gains from that would be relatively limited to the transportation sector and like the actual savings from what we do. But in a world where the US is like too small and is producing too little, and a lot of firms in the US are producing too little, when you expand access to inputs, when you expand access to output markets, you encourage all these firms to expand, you're going to get much more gain than the actual costs associated with that. The second thing is that it's hard to increase aggregate productivity through TFP growth, all right? Notwithstanding the lever of riches and the gifts from Athena, these are great and wonderful things, but they're hard to do. And it compounds over time, but maybe we get a little bit of it each year. It's much easier to increase aggregate productivity through greater input use when there are distortions. Okay? So we should definitely be trying to increase TFP, generate technological innovation, but we can get the same resulting growth and surplus by just embracing the fact that there are distortions in the economy and trying to do these other things that encourage the expansion of input use. All right, so to sum up, I would say we estimate in these couple of papers, but particularly this paper with Martin Rotenberg, really substantial productivity impacts from market access that come about from the railroads. Right? The key reason why we estimate this is because we allow for the presence of misallocation. We don't impose an efficient market structure on the economy. The resulting consequence of that is that these social savings type cost savings are not any meaningful bound on the aggregate gains from infrastructure. Recall for Fogel, the fact that transportation falls without the railroads means that it's an upper bound. That actually, like the gains from the railroads are even smaller. For us, the fact that the use of transportation falls without the railroads is precisely where the harm comes from. That's precisely where the losses are. Because as the use of transportation pulls back, it decreases economic activity in all these other sectors, and those sectors are inefficiently small, and so that's where all the losses take place. For those of you that might be familiar with like Harberger and taxes and like Harberger triangles, it's a very similar intuition going on in public finance there as well, where if you assume that the economy is efficient, you don't have to keep track of all these like second order effects in other markets. You can just look at that one market. But even Harberger himself in those original works, he talks about how when these other economies are distorted, or when distortions vary across these other economies, you can't rely on that Harberger triangle to bound the influence of the loss of taxes. You have to think about what's happening in those other markets as well. And we're kind of taking that same intuition to infrastructure and thinking about how it applies here. So I would say not only does social savings miss an important aspect, but the sort of hedonic intuition of looking at land values misses an important aspect as well, because land values reflect output that gets paid out to inputs. And in particular, it gets paid out to the fixed input, which capitalizes how much people are willing to produce. But payments to inputs don't capture all of the surplus that's not paid out to inputs in the first place. Right? That's what we're focused on with this aggregate productivity growth. So now kind of speaking to like Shea and Klenow, I would say reducing inefficiencies is good, but increasing inputs generates huge economic gains when there are those market inefficiencies. And so we don't have to just reduce the inefficiencies to get gains. We can increase inputs where there are inefficiencies. And so to paraphrase like, the Spider-Man, with great power comes great responsibility, with great problems come great possibilities, right? It's precisely in those places where there are the greatest inefficiencies that infrastructure can generate the largest aggregate economic gains, right? And so that's kind of what we've done to date. I would say in the future, the path that we're sort of exploring is using that establishment level data that I pointed out, which has information on both the values and quantities of inputs and outputs that were being used in the economy. We can use that to look at more broadly at the causes and consequences of productivity growth. My co-authors and I on this project, the main first initial project that we've done has been looking at the rollout of steam power in the US, and in particular, why the rollout of steam power was as substantially delayed as it was, and in particular, how access to early water power generated lock-in effects that kind of created these sunk costs that discouraged firms from adopting steam power. And in particular, there were these like recurring waves of sunk costs and lock-in because the steam power had very high fixed costs. And so a lot of the new entrants, when they would come in, they wouldn't adopt steam power because it required a much larger scale than they were initially. So you would think creative destruction would kind of eliminate sunk costs. And Joel's co-Nobel Prize winners would really emphasize this idea of creative destruction. That creative destruction is going to smooth out sunk costs and switching costs and be this grease that really mobilizes the economy. But that idea of creative destruction breaks down when even the new firms, when even the entrants get locked into the old technology, because the new technology requires a great deal of scale. So it has predictions for the types of new technologies that get rolled out quickly are ones that relatively appeal to small firms, to entrants, because their creative destruction can do its thing and get rid of the incumbents. But when the new technology is sort of predisposed to benefit larger firms, then creative destruction can't really get rid of the influence of lock-in and sunk costs. And so that's what we see playing out. That's what we see playing out with the rollout of steam power in the US, where people are locked into water power, and you have this really prolonged rollout of steam power. So, but more broadly, I would say both the causes and consequences of productivity growth in the US in like the 19th century, in this period of sort of rapid technological change, is a lot of what we're interested in. And so that's data that we've now made available at cmfdata.org. And we and others can just basically be using this for like a lot of, I think, potentially exciting things. All right, so that's what I had. Thank you very much. Looking forward to chatting more.
Thank you, Rick. If there's some questions from the audience, I'll run around with a microphone.
Where to start? I fully believe 27%, although I'd like to know what 27% means. Does that mean that in the year 1900, the US GDP was 27% higher than it would have been without railroads?
It doesn't mean GDP was 20% higher. It means that the aggregate, like the actual surplus value that we were getting from the railroads in like a dollar term relative to GDP was 27%. The easiest way to think about the magnitude is as if the economy was 27% more productive in a TFP sense. So it's like as if A in the aggregate production function was just 27% higher. That's what the railroads were giving us. So it's not that GDP was 27% higher, it's A was 27% higher.
And then compared to what? How do you actually conjecture what the canal system and alternative means of transportation would have turned into by 1900 without the railroads?
Yeah, that's where the modeling and the data work plays an important role because, and I think where it helps us a lot, that we don't treat the railroads as like an entirely different technology than the waterways or wagon transportation or ports or things like that. They're all part of a transportation network. And so people can transport goods through the rails, through waterways, through wagons at different costs. And so when you remove the railroad network, it's not like transportation is gone. It's just that transportation is just more expensive from place to place. And so we can kind of think about this counterfactual without the railroads, which is just, what do point-to-point transportation costs look like with the railroads? How did those point-to-point transportation costs change as the railroad network changed over time? And how would those point-to-point transportation costs change if you were to remove the railroad network and just have to use the waterways and canals and such? And then that's where we can add in like the proposed extensions to the canals. We could say, okay, we'll replace the railroads with further canals and calculate what those point-to-point costs look like. So we kind of put everything in the same denominator. We put it in the same sort of terms. And then we can more easily think about varying aspects of the transportation structure.
My last question is, your calculation of TFP, of course, is basically output growth minus input growth, but capital input is heavily determined by innovation and technology. And so TFP growth is overestimated by not including the value of innovation in the capital that is, of course, totally endogenous. So how do you handle that?
Yeah, I mean, capital inputs will increase with, productivity growth. I guess, some key distinction though between, capital input growth and like productivity growth is like in principle, like capital you have to pay for. Whereas, TFP, it comes from some market for R&D, but there's some presumption or sense that like you don't have to so repeatedly pay for it like once it's been innovated. And so, I mean, that's where we're thinking about the distinction there is like the growth in capital that just shows up on like books of these companies, we're going to take out as an input expenditure. I think obviously anybody who's worked with historical data on capital or even thought about capital recognizes it's like nearly impossible to measure actual capital usage in stocks. And so it's helpful for us that just like the main inputs that matter are materials and then labor. And like the capital share, the annual capital expenditures are sort of relatively small for these manufacturing firms. So how exactly we handle capital or inflated or deflated isn't so substantively important to the quantitative numbers that we have. But no, but it's a fair point, that there is a bit of a continuum between what's technology and what's capital. Yeah. Joe.
So Rick, I would actually like to say that even though your estimates consider considerable, upward correction to the old estimates produced by Vogel, actually I think you're still underestimating the effect of railroad. And you're talking about primarily about what you call market access, and that's basically what's driving everything, which leaves out, of course, all the backward linkages to at least three aspects of the American economy where railroad had a very powerful effect. The first is on the manufacturing of engines, which had major learning by doing effect since 1860 on, that then spilled over to manufacturing. The second thing is steel. So once cheap steel becomes feasible in the late 60s, early 70s, basically the entire set of rails in American railroads are converted, from wrought iron to steel. The third is something that actually nobody's even thought about quantifying, but I actually like it. That's Al Chandler's notion that the railroads were the source of the managerial revolution in the US in the last third decades of the 20th century. You take all of those backward linkages together, and I actually think you might increase your estimates by at least another 50%, although that's a very rough estimate, but that seems to be the right order. So in fact, you're just even underestimating the effect of railroads.
Yeah, I agree. I think we explicitly try to be clear maybe in the full paper that when we're doing this analysis, we're shutting down, impacts on TFP itself in the counterfactual analysis, backward linkages to the steel sector, increasing returns to scale. There's a fun fact that the railroads themselves were instrumental in getting accounting practices to change in terms of taking depreciation charges on balance sheets and and managerial type things. So for sure, I think that I wouldn't say that this 27% or 30% once you add the land values is all of it. It's more of it, but there still are opportunities to think about all these other different ways in which the railroads affected the U.S. economy from different mechanisms. And so I think I'm hopeful that a lot of people are using the market access data and the transportation cost data that we've made available to look at things. I'm hopeful that people can use that, and I'm hopeful similarly people can use the census and manufacturers data that we're making available to kind of look at some of those things also. So it's not that I'm so old that I don't want to do things myself anymore, but I'm happy for other people to help out with the lift as well, and start looking at a lot of these other mechanisms through which there are also effects. So I totally agree that there are other things also. It's not a presumed that we've found an upper bound or we've found the total of the effect. There's other things that we're not looking at, that we're holding fixed. I agree.
Hi there, I'm Chris Sims. I'm a PhD student here in the econ department. So one thing I was wondering about your approach is, the railways themselves are a local monopolist in transportation from the perspective of the counties they go through, because each county maybe has, in a rural area, one railroad. And so if you're a farmer, that's the railroad that's going to transport your goods. So then that sort of makes me wonder, how does that distortion also matter? Because then you would think transportation, even it's still inefficiently provided.
Yeah, it's interesting that and there has been a long tradition of sort of looking at the I/O of railroads themselves. It was interestingly competitive because the railroads could really undercut each other a lot, and there was a lot of building spur lines and kind of undercutting each other. But for sure, I think the implication of that would just be that the railroads were somewhat cheap. They were much cheaper than wagons, but in principle, maybe they could have been even cheaper if the market structure of the railroads themselves had been different. But they weren't earning particularly high profit margins, and they went bankrupt fairly often, in part because they weren't taking enough of a depreciation charge early on. But they didn't, order of magnitude, they didn't earn huge profits. Their private rate of return on capital was relatively low. So I agree. I think maybe a competitive railroad network or a railroad network priced closer to marginal cost could have had even larger benefit. But the main benefit, I think people have argued for the last 50 years over the exact prices of the railroads and waterways and such, but the order of magnitude thing is that both the waterways and the railroads were much cheaper than wagon transportation. And so it's like wagons would be like 25 cents per ton mile, and then railroads and waterways on the order of like half a cent per ton mile. And so whether it was half a cent or 25, 0.25 cents or something, it doesn't really matter in like the aggregate sense. So that's the kind of big cost savings. It's just it's cheaper than wagons. But, yeah.
They asked me to give my name, so I'm Philip Marks, and I'm actually both a Booth alum and undergraduate transportation economics from Wharton, where I studied under Eric Gelman, who helped get the building here. And I also actually work for Eric in Philadelphia. My question is related to network growth. So the fact that the rollout of the railroad connected so many more markets that previously did not have either economically efficient or time efficient, cost efficient or time efficient connections. It did not, the growth of the network itself, so it's referred to as network effects, also an airline and railroad. You didn't mention specifically network effects here. Is it perhaps because it's actually included in your term market access?
Yeah, I think the overarching goal of this notion of market access is to try to model sort of the trade network aspect of like economic exchange. That's sort of like the reason why some railroads going in, other railroads going in, them being able to move from one to the other. The reason why those will matter more or less in some places is through those network interactions. And so a lot of the heavy lifting in the background was sort of thinking about modeling supply and demand and transportation, and then taking all those forces and summarizing it up in this notion of market access. One of the things that helps us a lot with as well is that you would have noticed, in the modern era of thinking about causality in economics, we're not appealing to some notion that like railroads randomly got built in like one part of the country versus some other part of the country. There wasn't some sense that these private railroad companies were randomly building railroads somewhere versus somewhere else. And so we're not appealing to that for causality. We're really sort of using the fact that like even though people are directing railroads to where they think they're going to be most profitable and they're sort of directing them to particular places, those railroads where they get built, because of the way they sort of inadvertently affect other places and the way they interact with the waterway network, that's really like the key variation that we're using. And we even have a lot of specifications that like control for, do you get a railroad line? Or how much railroad line? Do you have sort of like local railroad construction? Setting that aside, like holding fixed what actually happens to your own local railroads, we use the ways that like the whole railroad network is shifting around the country to sort of generate places in particular areas market access. And so it ends up, we leverage a lot, both modeling and then using those network interactions for the empirical analysis and as part of the theory. So yeah. Yeah.
Is it working? Okay, cool. Hey, my name is Dominic. I am not a economics or transportation person, so I was just barely hanging on as you were talking. I'm a marketing and communications person. And so I really appreciated your historical context of the railroads versus the waterways and your even modern analysis of like the iPhones. But in your talk, you gave an example of like email and almost the lost opportunity cost if it didn't exist. Do your formulas and general thoughts on market access and distortions still hold up as it relates to the digitization of our entire world? For example, personally, I work remotely, but from a macro perspective, as we shift into knowledge work and digital and all of that, does your work still stand?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know why it would be fundamentally different. Trying to think about how to map this into like remote work. Remote work might almost be the opposite example though of the type of phenomenon I'm talking about. I mean, it's the same example, but in the opposite direction where, you might have a private taste for working remotely and like not having to commute into an office and like the convenience. So I think workers themselves very much like want remote work and benefit from it. But there might be some aggregate loss to the U.S. economy from remote work, and that you don't get people together in a space, sharing ideas more casually, learning from each other, benefiting from these kind of agglomeration economies. And so I think a lot of people in a university setting feel that in some sense, that like there's something about being around other people and like lunch conversations and casually bouncing ideas off that you learn from. There's something about being even in a classroom or being, seeing something in person or being somewhere that like you learn more and you interact more and you get more like these positive external benefits from that. And so, there could be some loss actually from like moving toward a world where people themselves narrowly want something, but there's going to be less of that. So it's like, in a sense, I would say probably there's like positive distortion. There's like distortions associated with like being in person in a workplace is probably under-provided. And so perhaps, the more that we enable people to be remote, we might actually lose a lot of the like zeal of cities and universities and in-person interactions that have been generating a lot of these gains to the US economy. So I might be almost worried about that being a step in the wrong direction in terms of mitigating some of these gains that we might otherwise have, is how I would think about it.
Time for one more question. Is there one more question?
Hi, I'm Roger Bauer. I graduated from Kellogg School many years ago. There's always a debate about the value of land grants for railroads and whether or not there was some inappropriate subsidy and so on. I've always argued that land in Utah, particularly with no water, had a limited value in terms of transportation, product, and so on. And the presence of the railroad, even though the railroad was subsidized with land grants, made the land more valuable. I'm just curious, does your research touch on that?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think so. The first paper, sort of directly focuses on how market access itself substantially raises agricultural land values in the place to get market access. So this idea that like the railroads themselves were making these places more valuable, and the land wouldn't have been worth very much without the railroads. So you kind of give something away that without the railroads isn't that valuable, and even if it's valuable with the railroads, you haven't really given away that much. So that's the first part of it. But then the second part of it, this second paper with Rotenberg, we have this sort of calculation that, that the social gains from the railroads was maybe 10 times what the private return on that capital was. And so, given that the railroads are having such a large sort of positive spillover effect on economic activity, you would presume it would be very much worth that place's while, and even the aggregate country's while, to subsidize and encourage the expansion of that infrastructure. I mean, it's very much relates to this idea that, with innovation or otherwise, like innovators tend to capture a very small share of the social gains from their innovation. And so, even if somebody inventing something, gets rich off of it, it's because they're generating gains from society, far in excess of that. So just the fact that like companies are making money off of it doesn't necessarily mean you wouldn't also want to subsidize and encourage, even more of it to take place.
Let's put our hands together for Rick.
Thank you.
Rick, I want to thank you for delivering the 7th Leon Moses lecture. And I also want to thank you for putting it in terms that for the non-economists in the room, we could follow along and understand. And you gave a great lecture.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
So.